Good. Okay, so we are starting today back with the Neoplatonic doctrine of virtues, and we're going to start with a recap of what we saw last time. So, yeah. Okay. So, right. So we finished last time Plotinus on virtue, and we came to um the end of that. And while we were reading, we saw that Plotinus draws on this idea of a that there's a higher self that we have to somehow identify ourselves with, right? So we saw, and so that's the first thing that I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to the Odyssey because at least for Proclus, that's a source of this idea that our true self is somehow our intellectual nature, and Proclus gets that idea uh, from Plotinus. And then we're going to turn to Plato's argument on the true self and the Alcibiades. And what's going to interest us is we're going to go beyond. So I mentioned this briefly in the Proclus courses as well, but now I want to really go into the argument. And not just his argument that who the person is actually the soul, but rather that we know ourselves by looking into somehow the contemplative soul of ourselves or of someone else, right? And so we'll see in some sense that, Plato's argument in the Alcibiades also helps us flesh out what this contemplation is that's supposed to be higher than purification, right? It says higher in the sense that there's, besides purifying yourself, you have to do something positive, which is turn towards nous, and that this turning towards nous ends up producing this uh, perspective shift where we start seeing ourselves as nous and looking at ourselves from nous's perspective. So that seems to be, science seems to be drawing on some ideas of Plato's argument in the Alcibiades for that. Um, I hope to get through this today. If we have some time, we'll already start on Platon on the life of Plotinus. But if not, we'll just do this. Okay?
Okay, that's great.
So this is the from on Virtue 6, right? For at this height, the man is the very being that came from the supreme. Primal excellence restored, the essential man is there in the intelligible. Entering the sphere, he has associated himself with a lower phase of his nature, but even this he will lead up into likeness with his highest self, as far as it is capable, so that it is possible it shall never be inclined to, at least never adopt any course displeasing to its overlord. So here he's talking already at the height of virtue, and he's talking about how in the height of virtue, we identify ourselves with our intelligible selves, with this part of ourselves that's in nous, that's always contemplating, right? And we look at like the personality that we had before that, was, that had desires that we first, learned to control and then that we fought through purification and learned to live without. We see that as now, oh, that's my lower part, right? So it's a different, there's this new idea of looking yourself from the perspective of your true self, right? And so yeah, here you have a person looking at themselves in the mirror, but there's this weird thing. It's the mirror itself that is the source of the light, right? So it's the true self that's the source of our light. And and so how does that happen, right? So that's the thing I want to go into the Platonic background for this. And Plotinus, for instance, at the end of Ennead 1:1, he says he refers to the Hercules story, and in order to flesh this out, so he says the poet too in the story of Hercules seems to give him this image separate existence, right? This image, the soul in our body. He puts the shade of Hercules in the lower world, and Hercules himself among the gods. Treating the hero as existing in the two realms at once, he gives us a twofold Hercules. And Homer himself, we'll see this in the next slide, but he uses the word himself, right, which becomes the key word in the Alcibiades argument. It is not difficult to explain this distinction. Hercules was a hero of practical virtue. By his noble serviceableness, he was worthy to be a god. On the other hand, his merit was action and not the contemplation which would place him unreservedly in the higher realm. Therefore, while he has place above, something of him remains below, of the shade. Now, you might think, well, that seems to imply that nothing of Plotinus will remain below if Plotinus has given himself entirely to contemplation. And we'll see that that's not entirely the case in Porphyry's life. There's a curious thing about Porphyry's life in the sense that the life itself functions as a kind of image of Plotinus, and Porphyry himself talks about people making a picture, like a sculpture of Plotinus. But anyway, there's this distinction, Plotinus trait this distinction between the higher self and the shadow, or the higher self and the image. He traces back to Homer, right? To this. After him, I was aware of powerful Heracles, his image, that is, but he himself, among the immortal gods, enjoys their festivals, married to sweet-stepping Hebe, child of great Zeus and hero of the golden sandals. All around him was a clamor of the dead, as of birds scattering scare in every direction. But he came on like dark night, holding his bow bare with an arrow laid on the bowstring, and forever looking as one who shot with terrible glances. And it goes on to describe him in more detail. But this is the idea, and there's this emphasis on the idea of the person himself as opposed to his image, which is also like a shadow in Hades. Um, so all this goes into the interpretation of Plato's Alcibiades argument. Any questions about this background, about what they're doing with poetry?
I think,
Okay. So
I mean,
backing it,
the interesting thing is that the story is like talking about a dead person or
right.
somehow, and then the interpretation is talking about a living person. We're like, here is the Hades.
Right, right. Here is the Hades. That's true. Or rather, it's also because, yeah, here is the Hades, or at least this soul here that gives us life. That's what goes to Hades, right? Not the nous, not the true intellectual soul, right? That's um. So there's also here a part, something about like answering questions about the afterlife. Oh my gosh, the afterlife is terrible. True. That's why identify with your nous, because that won't go to Hades. Right? Okay, so the argument about the soul being the true self comes in the context of interpreting what is self-knowledge, but Plato gets to self-knowledge through asking, how do you cultivate yourself, right? And so this is so it's and right, how do you take care of yourself, Epimenes? So, um, do you want to read this text on the
Okay.
screen?
So Socrates says, what skill is that? What skill is it that makes shoes better? And Alcibiades, shoemaking. Socrates, so shoemaking is the skill by which we take care of shoes. Yes. Do we use shoemaking to take care of our feet too? Or do we use that skill, the skill that makes our feet better? The latter. Isn't the skill that makes the feet better the same as what makes the rest of the body better? I think so. Isn't this skill athletics? Yes, absolutely. So while we take care of our feet with athletics, we take care of what belongs to our feet, the shoes, with shoemaking. Certainly. And while we take care of our hands with athletics, we take care of what belongs to our hands with ring making. Yes. And while we cultivate our bodies with athletics, we take care of what belongs to our bodies with weaving and other skills, like other clothing. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So while we cultivate each thing with one skill, we cultivate what belongs to it with another skill. Apparently so. I'm not sure what this belongs that is trying to get at me. And so when you're cultivating what belongs to you, you're not cultivating yourself. Not at all. For it seems that cultivating yourself and cultivating what belongs to you require different skills.
Right. So the background is like, what does it mean to cultivate yourself? Does it mean uh like to um become rich, right? To get lots of stuff. And this is supposed to be a first argument to say, no, cultivating yourself isn't accumulating things. And he uses the example of the body, right? And he's, and he also has this implicit premise that you have, each art has only one object. So if athletics takes care of the body, it's not going to take care of shoes. If shoemaking makes shoes, it's not going to take care of the body. Common Platonic idea that arts, crafts, or also even just powers are distinguished by their objects, right? So also like sight is is the power to know colors and perceive things with the eye, and it's just going to be that, right? So, and sight is different because its object is sights, and it's different from smells, which has a different object. With the power of the smell, that smells. So, that's the first thing. So uh, he's with this first argument, he wants to introduce a distinction between taking care of yourself and taking care of what belongs to you. What belongs to you can be your clothes, like in this case. It can also be things you own. It can even be things like your reputation, right? Something, your name, right, belongs to you. And so he wants to say cultivating yourself isn't these things. So that's like the first thing. But also by distinguishing yourself and what belongs to you, he's he wants to then jump to the idea that your body is just something that belongs to you. And so we'll see that now. So, and, but first he has this interlude. Well, then, would we ever know what skill makes us better if we didn't know what we were, right? Because we have to know the skill that makes us better is not what belongs to us. It's the one that ourselves as an object. So we didn't need to know who we are. Is it actually such an easy thing to know oneself? Was it some simpleton who inscribed those words on the temple wall at Delphi, or is it difficult? Not for everyone, right? Know yourself here in the mosaic Auton. Um, Sometimes I think Socrates that anyone can do it, but then sometimes I think it's extremely difficult, right? And reflecting this common thing of, sometimes knowing yourself seems just, yeah, obviously you know what's going on inside you, you know your thoughts, but then you are surprised at yourself at acting in different ways and or in feeling things that you didn't expect that you would feel or thinking things you didn't expect you would think, and then it seems like it's very difficult to know yourself. But Alcibiades, whether it's easy or not, nevertheless, this is the situation we're in. If we know ourselves, then we might be able to know how to cultivate ourselves. But if we don't know ourselves, we'll never know how. I agree. Tell me, how can we find what itself is in itself? Maybe this is the way to find out what we ourselves might be. Maybe it's the only possible way. You're right. Now, what's significant in the text is that Socrates does not actually follow through with his suggestion. He does not investigate what itself is in itself, right? Um, there are a couple of different interpretations of what this means. So on the face of it, in a Platonic context, it can mean, finding out what the idea of itself is. What does it mean to be itself? Especially, what is this itself that we append to after the end of any forms, beauty itself or equality itself or something like that. And um, but other people, for instance, Olympiodorus, a Neoplatonic commentator, already thought that what itself is in itself meant the intellectual part of the soul. But in any case, they don't do this immediate inquiry into what itself is. Instead, they Socrates is seized by a sudden insight, right? Do you want to read this part?
Okay. Socrates, hold on. By Zeus, who are you speaking with now? Anybody but me? No. And I am speaking with you. Yes. Is Socrates doing the talking? He certainly is. And is Alcibiades doing the listening? Yes. And isn't Socrates talking with words? Of course. I suppose you'd say that talking is the same as using words. Certainly. But the thing being used and the person using it, they're different, aren't they? What do you mean? A shoemaker, for example, cuts with a knife and a scraper, I think, and with other tools. Yes, he does. So, isn't the cutter who uses the tools different from the tools he's cutting with? Of course. And likewise, isn't the lyre player different from what he's playing with? Yes.
Okay. So here there's a quick change of the argument, and now he introduces this distinction between himself and the words he is using. So this is analogous to before between the body and and the clothes that belong to the body. Not only clothes but also adornments, right? Rings. Um, and but words is, but he's also changed from talking about what belongs to someone and what they're using, right? Now, whether Plato can strictly abide by this idea that um, the user is always distinct from what it's using is unclear. Because sometimes, there might be reflexive situations. So you can use yourself. For instance, if you keep yourself from eating a chocolate by reminding yourself that you're on a diet. Then you have, say, used one part of yourself, your belief, to control another part of yourself. And it seems that you can use parts of yourself on yourself. And so it's not clear, of course, whether then the person and the thing being used are distinct. And this is also clear with, I mean, this is might be part of the reason also talking about words, because words, he used the word logos, which can mean speech, um, but it can also mean, of course, thought. And so it's both an instrument, but also a part of the person, right? Um, but you know, so that's already some concerns that show up here. Words seem to be more part of a person than, say, the instruments of the shoemaker, the cutter, and the lyre player. Right. Lyre player, of course, for a later Platonist might remind them of the idea of the soul as a harmony, right? And so that's in the Phaedo, right? And that might, and of course, the Platonic view is that soul can't be a harmony because the soul exists separately from the body, and it's not like when the instrument stops being played, the soul ceases to exist. However, might be true of the image of the soul, right? And so that that's a suggestive idea. Um, And it's interesting that he starts down here with the shoemaker, both also in the previous example, because so platonically, the rational soul in the Timaeus at least is in the head, right? So he's starting from below and going up, right? If he's making his way up to the rational soul. So those are some concerns about the argument so far. Then he's going to move to one of the more key moves, which is that a human being is different from his body. This is what I was just asking. Doesn't the user of a thing always seem to be different from what he's using? It seems so. Let's think about the shoemaker again. Does he cut with his tools only, or does he also cut with his hands? With his hands too. So he uses his hands too. Yes. And doesn't he use his eyes too in shoemaking? Yes. Didn't we agree that the person who uses something is different from the thing that he uses? Yes. So the shoemaker and the lyre player are different from the hands and eyes they use in their work. So it seems. Doesn't a man use his whole body too? Certainly. We agree that the user is different from the thing being used. Yes. So a man is different from his own body. So it seems. Um, Now, although um, Aristotle will later say, deny that the soul exists separately, at least appear to deny it when he defines it as the form of the body. he does say it's the form of the organic body. And organic here there means as an instrument, right? And so it's I precisely this idea that the human body is something that's used by the person, right, for certain ends. Um, so here the this is the so the idea here, and of course he's established that it's different from the body, and not yet that the person is separate from the body, right? It's just that it's distinct. So there are even senses in which an Aristotelian could get on board with this. Um, and also if we think about the case that we had before of controlling yourself, right? Um, there we saw that like we can use our imagination or our beliefs to control our passions. Um, so there we're using imagine. There we have by this argument we have to be distinct from our imagination, our beliefs, and also distinct from our passions. But that doesn't mean that. And there's Platonic room for thinking. Well, yes, the rational soul, right? Reason is distinct from these two things. So that he first makes this argument that the human being is different from his body. And then he goes on to say that it's not his body. Then what is a man? I don't know what to say. Yes, you do. You say that it's what uses the body. Yes. What else uses it but the soul? Nothing else. Doesn't the soul rule the body? Yes. Now here's something I don't think anybody would disagree with. What man is one of three things. What things? The body, the soul, or the two of them together, the whole thing, of course. But we agree that the man is that which rules the body. Yes, we did agree to that. Does the body rule itself? It couldn't, because we said it was ruled. Yes. So this can't be what we're looking for. Um, so he's gone from, that the man is not the body, or the man is different from the body, to the man is not the body. Um, what the and what he's introduced in the middle is the soul, right? So whatever makes the person alive, the intrinsic principle of their being alive. And precisely, he's gone also from use to ruling. And the idea of ruling probably has to do with the fact that um there's an asymmetry between the two, and also in some sense that the um yeah, I mean there's an asymmetry between the two, but I guess you could say but also that like the asymmetry is built in. When you just say, for instance, that the this knife is an instrument for the shoemaker, you wouldn't say that the shoemaker rules the knife, partially because the knife won't rebel, and so there's nothing to control here. It's not a living thing. But also because, the anyone can pick up the knife and use it. So the ruling also indicates some kind of possession, right? Because it determines what the body is going to do. Um, and of course, part of the argument here now is that the body doesn't rule itself. Um, well, um, partially, I mean, here it's the argument is just because it was ruled, but of course, you could say, well, if something rules itself, it's ruled. Um, but
Yeah.
um, yeah, everything okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Um, but so but there's this political dimension that's been introduced, and that's somehow is supposed to justify that the man is not um, the body. This seems to be stronger than um, the the man is different from the body, because you could say that the body uses itself and it's denied, and he denied this. Why doesn't the body use itself? Maybe the idea is it it's not a when it's a lot when it's dead, it doesn't control itself, right? It's entirely it's just a dead body. It's subject to what anyone wants to do with it. Whereas to the degree that there is some self-control, that there is some life in it, it's only while the soul is there, and therefore it doesn't rule itself. Um, so so that's the one step of the argument. Then he makes the further argument that it's then his soul. Not likely. Well, then, can the two of them together rule the body? Is this what a man is? Yes, maybe that's it. No, that's the least likely of all. If one of them doesn't take part in ruling, then surely no combination of the two could rule. You're right. Now, this is already, Olympiodorus and people previous to him observed. This doesn't really follow because there are some things that it's true of both, but it's not just true of one. And for a classical example, being two, right? So soul and body are two, and but they're only two together, right? The soul alone is one, and the body alone is one. It's only together they're two. So it could be that the soul only rules the body together with the body. Um, the um, so someone could make this theoretical objection, and then also say, well, also and so it's wrong to say that the body rules itself, but it is true to say that the soul body compound rules the body. Um, that's a possible move here. A Platonist might answer that, right, and that would somehow make sense in the sense that also someone might say, well, the rational soul purely doesn't have an ability to influence the body. It needs the use of sensation and imagination, which are bodily things to act on it. So only the soul body compound rules the body. But that's not the way this argument goes, and it could be, I mean, one of the things that Plato does to avoid this kind of thing is arguments via conflict, right? So you need whatever determines has to be united, because otherwise you could get things ruling in opposite directions, and that's not rule at all. So the possibility that the body, say, could have one desire, it could be hungry, and yet the soul another thing, shows that um, it can't be the soul body compound that together rules, right? Because ruling has to be one thing. Um, that's one way. But anyway, as written, there's this hole in the argument.
Mm.
Um, you're right. Since a man is neither his body nor his body and soul together, what remains, I think, is either that he's nothing, or else if he is something, he's nothing other than his soul. Quite so. Do you need any clearer proof that the soul is man? No, by Zeus, I think you've given ample proof. So that's the first argument for that the soul is man, right? Of course, for Neoplatonists, this will be strengthened by, they'll have developed also arguments that connect it to the fact um, that the soul is a substance, that it's immortal, that the body depends on the soul for its motion, because the soul is the self mover and the body is only else moved. So that they have, this enters into a general pool of arguments for identifying yourself with your soul. That's the Alcibiades argument. Now, he says, no, no, by Zeus, I think you've given ample proof. But as I mentioned, he hasn't done what he thinks is the only way to do this, which is how can we find out what itself is in itself? And he comes back to this fact. Well, if we've proven it fairly well, although perhaps not rigorously, that will do for us. We'll have a rigorous proof when we find out what we skipped over because it would have taken quite a lot of study. What was that? What we just mentioned, what we mentioned just now, that we should first consider what itself is in itself. But in fact, we've been considering what an individual self is instead of what itself is. Like he says, we've been considering what each of us is, right? What each self is in the Greek instead of what itself is. So we haven't made this universalizing move to itselfness, right? Perhaps that was enough for us, for surely nothing about us has more authority than the soul, wouldn't you agree? Certainly. So the right way of looking at it is that when you and I talk to each other, one soul uses words to address another soul. So he picks up um, the example of talking again, and so words again are what is used. Um, okay. The And of course, a third way of, so I mentioned cashing out itself in terms of like going after what the itself informs is about. We could also think that this is already about our true identity as intellectual souls. But another way of thinking about what itself is that this is an inquiry into unity, right? Because what makes each thing one, what makes each thing itself is unity itself. So um, that's a different way. And so you could think of the, you know, Tynus's effort to, you know, figure out what the one is and talk about the one or unity as prior to nous and prior to the soul. That would be what the rigorous proof is. Um, but okay. So that was the first thing. So the human being is the soul. But going on, he then goes into a question, goes back to the question of cultivation. How do you cultivate yourself? And so if you are the soul, how do you do that? And we have to know this soul. And here there comes a famous passage about the eye and about people looking into each other's eyes. Now, how can we get the clearest knowledge of our soul? If we knew that, then we probably know ourselves as well. By the gods, mimicking the by Zeus before. That admirable Delphic inscription we just mentioned. Know yourself. Didn't we understand it? What's the point of bringing that up again, Socrates? I'll tell you what I suspect that inscription means and what advice it's giving us. There may not be many examples of it except the case of sight. What do you mean by that? You think about it too. If the inscription took our eyes to be men and advised them, see thyself. How would we understand such advice? Shouldn't the eye be looking at something in which it could see itself? Obviously. Let's think of something that allows us both to see both it and ourselves when we look at it. Obviously, Socrates, you mean mirrors and that sort of thing. Quite right. And isn't there something like that in the eye which we see with? Right. Certainly. So he admits quite clearly the certainly in part because this is about a theory of sight, right? So you see things because images of them are formed in your eye, right? And so that's why, clearly he accepts this idea that the eye itself is something like a mirror, right? As we look at the world and we see all these different things, it's because where we have a mirror inside our eye, and that uh, creates all these images in us. And But Socrates goes more into detail. I'm sure you've noticed that when a man looks into an eye, his face appears in it, like in a mirror. We call this the pupil, for it's a sort of miniature of the man who's looking. So, right, the pupil, right, the black center of the eye, it will, if you look at someone, you'll see a reflection there. Also, because it's all black and it's not colored like the iris. So you'll see a reflection in there. And Socrates may be thinking about um, a theory of sight that says that reflection that we see reflected in a pupil, that's the image that the person has and that they're seeing, right? So you're right. So Alcibiades admits this thing that we know what we're really interested is in the pupil, because that's the thing um, in that looks like a mirror that has this reflective property, and that's through which we see. Then an eye will see itself if it observes an eye and looks at the best part of it, the part with which it can see, so it seems. But it won't see itself if it looks at anything else in a man, or anything else at all, unless it's similar to the eye. You're right. So if an eye is to see itself, it must look at an eye, and at that region of it in which the good activity of an eye actually occurs. And this, I presume, is seeing. That's right. Then if the soul Alcibiades is to know itself, it must look at a soul, especially at that region in which makes a soul good. Wisdom occurs, and at anything else which is similar to it. I agree with you, Socrates. So here he makes a point that um, self-knowledge is possible um, through something, uh, through something, through some other, or rather through a something that knows can know itself if it knows itself being known by another knower, right? That's the idea. And if the knowledge of the eye is sight and it takes place there in the pupil, then it's by looking into in someone else's eye. If the knower now is the soul and what it knows is like mm, science or like demonstrated knowledge, reason, right? That the kind of knowledge that it wants is wisdom, then it has to look at another soul, right? Know another soul and know itself in that other soul, right? So that other soul has to be knowing it as well. And it has to be so just as like the eye that we look at can't be closed and it can't be weak in some way, like can't have like tiny pupils because it's taken drugs or some thing that squid makes it not take in the light, or it can't be dark and so on. So also we have to know ourselves through a wise person, through another wise soul. This picks up in part, because the the move that Socrates made way back, which when he said, so the right way of looking at it is that when you and I talk to each other, one soul uses words to address another soul. So here he got through, as it were, bodies. Since conversation is between person to person, conversation is a contact between soul and soul. And if conversation is a contact between soul and soul, then we can do this thing of looking into another soul and specifically its wisdom and seeing how it reflects us. Right. And if, like in context, this is also about Alcibiades coming to know himself by seeing himself as Socrates sees him. Um, and there are issues about that, but we'll get it. And it's also a picture that shows up in the Phaedrus, right? In the Phaedrus, the you fall in love with someone because you see a trace of your God in them. And then that makes you want to become more like your God. But then you then, start pursuing your beloved and helping them, and you help them become more like your God as well. So there's, as it were, um, this reflection where the beloved, he sees himself in the lover, right? Sees himself as this divine figure in the lover, and then therefore is called to, you know, become more divine. And this is the theme of the Alcibiades, that Socrates is the only one that's Alcibiades' true lover because he loved him for himself. He didn't love his young body, he didn't love his riches, but rather he stands there even when everyone else has already lost interest in him. He continues interested in him because he's interested in him for himself. So in both the Alcibiades and in the Phaedrus, we have this thing about the beloved coming to know himself through the eyes of the lover, and specifically here the lover is the wise man, right? The wise soul. So, and then there's a key part that there's a textual issue. I agree with you, Socrates, right? Can we say that there's anything about the soul which is more divine than that where knowing and understanding take place? No, we can't. Then that region in it resembles the divine. And someone who looked at that and grasped everything divine, vision and understanding, would have the best grasp of himself as well. So it seems. So this resembles the divine. It's theo in the Greek. But there's a problem here because it says then that region and it resembles the divine. But we just extend, how can you say it's the most divine thing and then you infer that it resembles the divine? It seems like you've already stated it. You're saying like if A, then A. And also there's a problem. There are two other problems. One is that immediately following this, here, there's two sources of ours give us lines. So Eusebius and Stobaeus, they give us lines here that don't appear in any of the manuscripts that develop this idea and that go back to the idea of reflection, of the mirror, because the idea of the mirror disappears here and it doesn't come back. And um, and so there's a debate about whether those things are real, whether these other lines, do they belong to the text or they don't? They're not in the Cooper translation, so they're not here. They stick them into a footnote. But there's a problem because they pick up this idea of being a mirror, right? This idea of the eye as a mirror. However, if you delete those lines and they're not in any of the manuscripts, so you're fine. You come with a problem because later the idea of shininess is mentioned. And he says, as we mentioned before, it's shiny. And so, like that wisdom is shiny. So, if you didn't mention that wisdom was shiny before, if you didn't bring in the mirror again, then you're in trouble. And that second passage is in all the manuscripts. So, what are the solutions? I was quite convinced by a proposal of Harold Tarrant that he thinks that this Theo resembles the divine originally was Leo, and that would mean is smooth and is reflective. And so he would say, can we say that there is anything about the soul which is more divine than that where knowing and understanding take place? No, we can't. Then that region in it is smooth. And someone who looked at that and grasped everything divine, vision and understanding would have the best grasp of himself as well. Right. And then here we can understand the then, right? Then if it's where uh, knowing understanding, then uh, it's smooth and uh, someone could because it's going back to this argument here, right? That the region that makes a soul good is where we have to look at and where will be reflected, and that's what will and that's how you know yourself by looking at other things and at another soul. So this is really, I mean, so Plotinus probably didn't have like it could very well be that the text was already corrupted by the time that Plotinus read it. It didn't have the extra lines, we know. It didn't have the extra lines. But so it could be that it didn't have Leo here for Plotinus. But what it did have was it had this notion that you know yourself by looking at a truly intellectual soul, by looking at wisdom, and therefore you know yourself and you cultivate yourself. And that seems to be then, the proper contemplative virtue for Plotinus, which is not just turning away, let's say, turning away from the vulgar lovers that only want your body and your riches and your youth and things like that, and turning towards nous, right? And in turning towards nous, you know yourself. And you not only know yourself, but you are in a position to cultivate yourself and to become a better person, right? So this is where you get be, in in Plato, it seems clear that the idea is that it's two different people, but if you collapse that into one person, you'd get the two selves of Plotinus, right? If you'd say, oh, you turn to your nous, and then right. So so that's the Platonic background to back here, right? For at this height, the man is the very being that came from the Supreme. The primal excellence restored, the essential man is there, right? So who the human being really is in the intelligible, is in wisdom. Entering this sphere here, the perceptual world, he has associated himself with the lower phase of his nature. But even this he will lead up into likeness with his highest self, like the lover leads the beloved in uh, in Plato, as far as it is capable, so that if possible, it shall never be inclined to, and at least never adopt any course displeasing to its overlord. So, right, there was that idea also that Plotinus mentioned, right? The lower nature, why does it obey reason? Well, it's like someone who lives next door to a wise person and is terribly ashamed of doing anything in the presence of this wise person that isn't, proper. And again, this idea of shame brings in love and not being not wanting to do shameful things before the people that you want their respect or you want their affection. This comes up in the symposium in the first speech. Why armies of lovers are better because they're ashamed of being cowards in front of each other. Um, and and so that seems to be, the Platonic background to this true man idea. It's not the As I mentioned, it's not the soul thing. Also, the stuff like from the Phaedo about the immortality of the soul and stuff from the Republic comes in. But this idea of the true self in the Alcibiades seems quite important as well. Okay.
Yeah, so but yeah.
So
So
yeah.
what
Yes. So do you have like a yeah? We pause now for questions about the true self and Plotinus.
yeah. So what do you think about this, like where it became into two? I mean, Plato is talking about the true self of one person, where and implying that he has a non-true self, but he does uh he does have the whole time being uh it doesn't really yeah, I don't remember. Like
Right. So
what?
there's yeah. So the eye analogy is what makes it really seem like that you need another eye. So you need another soul. Um, and you could say, well, that's just the limits of this analogy, but since wisdom itself, so um Plato thinks that, wisdom itself in the form of nous itself exists separately, right? He calls the demiurge nous itself. And so and so you could say there's a separately existing nous that we can turn to. And um, so that, might be a thing to say, Plato already has, affords the possibility for people to collapse this. Also in the Theaetetus, l- thought is defined as the soul's speech within itself. So the soul talks to itself. And and it's often, the case in Platonic dialogues that you have Socrates going, well, you could imagine someone saying this and then answering that and something like that, right? So the there are these imagined dialogues, um, and so there is, and of course, if you're reading a dialogue, you're having a dialogue with yourself. So all this, of course, me to say that the telescoping of both the higher self and the lower self into a single person, and then to making this, as it were, you're just turning to your higher self, is very Platonic. Also, the emphasis on anamnesis, right? The emphasis that the all learning is actually remembering, and so that what Socrates is doing is just helping people give birth to the knowledge that they already have. Usually, the knowledge that they already have is that they don't know, but anyway, um, the this also implies, in some sense, of course, that Socrates is dispensable. People do give birth, mothers do give birth occasionally without a midwife and without assistance. Like sometimes you're in that necessary situation, and um, the so all that implies also, that people can be autodidacts, and that you don't really need necessarily the teacher, right? Especially because the teacher is not pouring uh, wisdom into you like from outside. Um, which I think is also right. Well, it's just a tangential thing, but I think it's like a very important thing about like the whole connection with love because it can seem, rather worrying if Plato connects like erotic love with teaching nowadays because you say, well, the student looks up to the teacher, and then that would be a problem, especially like it seems like a situation where people abuse this because then the if the teacher is the sole way for the student to become a better person because we're talking about moral education. That seems worrying. However, this whole emphasis on the fact that each person can study on their own and can become a good person on their own militates against that. The teacher is not a necessary medium, and furthermore, it's shown in practice by the fact that when Alcibiades in the symposium wants to give Socrates sexual favors because he loves him as a teacher, Socrates says no, right? Because it's not the body that you're actually interested in. It's not the body that I'm interested in. We're here to make you a better person, things like that. So so yeah, I mean, I think that on there's a surface level where you have to be you need two people, but there's already lots of elements in Plato that you need that suggest that you could telescope this into just one person. Also, I mean, if you look at how this develops, so Aristotle takes over this idea that, like in the Eudemian ethics, that one of the good things about having friends is that you know yourself better. You see yourself in your friend as in a mirror, right? And the friend can correct you and can help you. Um, but Aristotle also talks about being a friend with yourself, right? And and also that the virtuous are the best friends because they're the most united. Wicked people can't have friends because they're all split into many parts. So all that suggests that this idea, this telescoping of the both of the uh, dialogue partners into a single soul, is something that has like ample ground for in Plato himself.
Mhm.
Um, the well, yeah, and it also brings up another question because this ties in actually to the question of the daimon, which is the next Platonian treatise. Because one way of thinking about this, me and my higher self, is me and my daimon, right? So in the Timaeus, we'll see the passage, but in the Timaeus, it seems to identify the daimon with the rational soul. And of course, there are other Platonic texts which make the daimon to be this separate spirit from Socrates that inspires him and keeps him from doing things. And and then also in other texts, there's Eros as a daimon. And so that's a different way of of seeing already in Plato this telescoping of the dialogue into one person and in between now mortal and some kind of divine being. right? So that's there as well. And but before we get into, let me see what, yeah, we still have half an hour, so let me start the Life of Plotinus going. Unless you have like
Okay.
questions about, because like this was a recap, so there might be
No,
questions.
right. Okay. Yeah. It's no, just this thing about like how in there. I mean, it might have to do with like form of the dialogue, where Plotinus isn't writing dialogues, and maybe it's a question why not, or maybe it's because of this. I'm not sure.
R- Right, we'll talk about Plotinus's writing style soon, and he because Porphyry talks about it, and also yeah, although Plotinus doesn't write dialogues, he often has, as it were, arguments with imaginary interlocutors. Someone might say, and often Stoics, right? As I mentioned, he never used the word Stoic, but he always uses these people and those people, uh,
Hmm.
referring to Stoics. These people would say, those people would say. So now we're going to look at the life of Plotinus, but specifically these questions about virtue and self, right? And seeing yourself and seeing your higher self, and thereby becoming a better person. So I'm not going to follow the life chronologically, which is also not what Porphyry does. But I'm going to go through many things, many issues that come up and that show us like what kind of a sage, what kind of a virtuous person um, Porphyry takes Plotinus to be. And I've structured this in a way that it's kind of like the passage from political virtues to higher virtues. So we start with the fact with Porphyry talking about um, the political side. So Plotinus has followers and friends. He's a father of orphans. He even has a political project at one point. And then we'll look at things that have to do with his, virtues that have to do with his relations with other people. So his empathy, so his penetrating insight into people's situations, and also how he conducted discussions in class. But then we start to see how he separates himself from, this world, starting with how careless he is when he talks and writes. And then we'll see him recommending people renouncing politics, right? And so there's a student of his who was a senator and gave it all up and led a philosophical life, and Plotinus says, and held him up as an example. And then we'll see passages where Porphyry talks about how Plotinus was always turned towards nous or turned towards his higher self. And associated with that, there's an episode where it's revealed that Plotinus has a divine daimon. And Porphyry writes that he wrote his text on our guardian spirit because of this event. And then, but of course, there's more than Nous and Plotinus, and there's this idea that Plotinus was united with the One, and we'll look at that. And of course, this idea that Plotinus does more than go up to Nous is also one of the things that suggests that there's more to virtue than just ending with the virtues of Nous, which is where Plotinus's treatise ends, right? And finally, Porphyry talks about Plotinus's afterlife, where it seems like he became a daimon. And that, of course, raises questions, and for what diamonds are and things. So we'll see how that goes. But before that, let's take a look at the opening of the life, which is quite interesting from the perspective of who is the true Plotinus. So here it starts. Plotinus, the philosopher contemporary, seemed ashamed of being in the body. So deeply rooted was this feeling that he could never be induced to tell of his ancestry, his parentage, or his birthplace. He showed too an unconquerable reluctance to sit to a painter or a sculptor. And when Emilius persisted in urging him to allow of a portrait being made, he asked him, "Is it not enough to carry about this image in which nature has enclosed us? Do you really think I must also consent to leave as a desirable spectacle to posterity an image of the image?" Now, um, there, there are many questions here. Well, some people really laid stress on this seems. He only seemed of being ashamed of the body. He wasn't really ashamed of being in the body because, he's not agnostic. He doesn't think corporeality is bad. Other people have pointed out that Plotinus was an Egyptian. He didn't even come from one of the main Egyptian cities, not from Alexandria. He came from Lycopolis, way down south. And so this can be, this is a register of someone feeling bad about being a foreigner in Rome. And that psychological social interpretation, I think, is has some merit. I don't think it disqualifies the fact that, of course, the context here is like Platonist theories about the body, because you can make sense of of difficulties that you've suffer because of your social situation through larger metaphysical claims. Like you feel you feel exiled in the world, and then you understand, no, it's the world is exile. Oh, okay. And so it's probably something similar here in Plotinus, right? And also, of course, he's brings in this question about that the body is an image, and that's already the language that he uses to talk about the soul and the body, right? And he doesn't want them to make a portrait of him, although they do, right? In view of this determined refusal, Emilius brought his friend Carterius, the best artist of the day, to the conferences, which were open to every comer, and saw to it that by long observation of the philosopher he caught his most striking personal traits. From the impressions thus stored in mind, the artist drew a first sketch. Emilius made various suggestions towards bringing out with a resemblance, and in this way, without the knowledge of Plotinus, the genius of Carterius gave us a lifelike portrait. Um, Now, why start your life of Plotinus like this? One of the reasons is that you're making a picture of Plotinus when you write it. So Porphyry's life, and also the life, is a kind of introduction to his edition of the Enneads. He also goes into the chronology of the writings and also into how he decided to order it. Porphyry was an admirably conscious philologist, and so he had the idea that he has to give both the chronology and how he has decided to order it. And the whole book is, in a sense, all the Enneads together with his introduction is a picture of the man, right? And so that's the maybe the idea of why he's doing this. Now, of course, this is just a shadow, right? The true Plotinus is the intellectual soul, right? The intellectual soul shining out behind here that's producing this shadow. And that's probably possibly an idea for why Porphyry organized the Enneads thematically, because the point isn't to give you an idea of Plotinus's chronology from beginning to end, and so a biography. Rather, the Enneads should give you the content of his thought. And so because that is the true Plotinus, right? It's his wisdom. And so that's why you organize it thematically and not chronologically. But in any case, so these ideas about, what is the true Plotinus and what is the true self already appear, in reading the life and reading the Enneads more generally. Because, like, are you reading this to have access to the image, that person who lived in Rome at that period, or are you reading this in order to access the wisdom and to see yourself reflected in that wisdom and then to criticize yourself in light of that? So that's for me, like when we're studying Plotinus on virtue and the Neoplatonic doctrine of virtues, that's part of the of what's behind this. Um, there's more to say, but I'll say it more as we go on to when we get to Neoplatonists that have ideas about what paradigmatic virtue is. Because yeah, we'll do that for now. Or wait, yeah, for now I want to stick with Plotinus and and what the life gives us.
Okay.
Um, so first thing, Plotinus has followers and friends. That's a first thing. So like this idea of sage is not, the guy living all alone. He has a large following, right? There are many people who come to his lectures. Within the lectures, he has close personal friends, right? That's so there's like this distinction, Porphyry, between like the out group and the in group. And also, um, there's both men and also women in this group, in this group. So there's, it's a mixed society. Um, the so becoming contemplative sage does not mean that you remove yourself from society. Not only that, you don't remove yourself, but you have social responsibilities. Not a few men of women, Porphyry tells us, not a few men and women of position on the approach of death had left their boys and girls with all their property in his care, feeling that with Plotinus for guardian, the children would be in holy hands. His house, therefore, was filled with lads and lasses, amongst them Potamon, in whose education he took such interest as often to hear the boy recite verses of his own composition. He always found time for those that came to submit returns of the children's property, and he looked closely to the accuracy of the accounts. Until the young people take to philosophy, he used to say, their fortunes and revenues must be kept intact for them. And yet all this labor and thought over the worldly interests of so many people never interrupted during waking hours his intention towards the Supreme. He was gentle and always at the call of those having the slightest acquaintance with him. After spending 26 years in Rome, acting too as arbiter in many differences, he had never made an enemy of any citizen. So he not only has this, he not only takes care of people, he takes father to these orphans, but he also does not impose a philosophical way of life on everyone. So until these children have made a decision that they're also going to become philosophers and abandon material concerns and so on, he makes sure that that their inheritance is preserved. And also, he not only is responsible for these people, he also acts as an arbiter. So he settles disputes amongst people. People come to him because he becomes an authority in the community, and so he not only is given children to raise, but also people come to him to settle disputes. And right, and so that's so he is politically active. Although uh, Porphyry makes a point of saying, his intention was always directed towards the supreme, right? So the supreme here, it's the expression could mean nous or it could mean the one. It's unclear. And furthermore, he pursues politics. So uh, Porphyry talks about his friendship with an emperor, and then he says, in Campania there had once stood, according to tradition, a city of philosophers, a ruin now. Plotinus asked the emperor to rebuild the city and to make over the surrounding districts to the new founded states. The population was to live under Plato's laws. The city was to be called Platonopolis, and Plotinus undertook to settle down there with his associates. He would have had his way without more ado, but that opposition at court, propped in by jealousy, spite, or some such paltry motive, put an end to the plan. So it didn't fulfill, this political plan didn't fulfill, although he apparently had this large household and all these many students to take care of, but a larger political plan didn't happen. But it shows that, he did not think this was incompatible with being a philosopher, founding a new city. Um, and Domenico Meri's book on, politics in the Neoplatonic tradition takes its name from this, Platonopolis. And of course, the Enneads don't give us a good idea of what his interpretation of Plato's laws would be. But it's all this shows, a lot of involvement of Plotinus in his community and with other people. This is shown also in his empathy, right? So he had a remarkable penetration into character, as Porphyry puts it. Once a valuable necklace was stolen, so he gives this account of how once oh, um, a woman was stolen, and Plotinus recognized the thief just by, uh, 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 basically just by considering them and looking at them, and he turned out to be right. And also, the children, he would say, "Oh, this one has such a character and destiny, and it will be like that." So here, it seems like more than just penetration into character. There's some kind of clairvoyance here, like of seeing people's futures. Um, he- Porphyry also writes that he did take an interest in astrology, in casting horoscopes, although he was very critical of what he saw was like errors in that. And you can see like that being critical of these errors is one diviner like criticizing another. It's like he is someone who has this ability. Like I know people, I know something about what's going to happen to them, and so from that point of view, I criticize these things. He has one of his last treatises is on are the stars causes, and there it's very critical of astrology, but especially of like Ptolemaic astrology that treats the stars as in some sense causing the events down here, whereas Plotinus is more of the view that they are just symbols of things that happen down here. Anyway, Plotinus also talks about, Porphyry also talks about the time that Plotinus saw that he was very depressed and that he was going to kill himself. So Porphyry doesn't tell Plotinus this, but Plotinus shows up one day and says, "Look, I know you're thinking about these things. It's a bad idea. You're just Rome isn't good for you. Go somewhere else, take a time off, and then and be better." And indeed, Porphyry says that did help me, but then because of that, I wasn't with him at the time of his death. So this shows that part of what of this action of his authority and of his wisdom is insight into other people. He's not ignorant of human matters. He knows about human affairs. And we see also this, his, as it were, sociality in what Porphyry tells about how he dealt with people in his classroom. So one thing that is not here, but because it's just a very short passage, he says that apparently when Porphyry arrived the at the school at Plotinus' school to learn with him, Emilius, who had been there already like 11 years, told Porphyry that Plotinus had like this really bad habit, well, according to Emilius, of just letting anyone ask questions and then taking them up on those questions. And that meant that like the classes were never very objective and to the point. They would go around in many uh, directions. So that's also already like part of his view of how he teaches. It's through questions and answers. It's not through just expounding a doctrine. And we see this also in these two passages. So, actually, why don't you read these?
Okay. You're just blocking this one. When he was speaking, when he was speaking, I could find it here. Which number is it? Uh,
Oh, okay. You want the number in the thing?
because just because your face is blocking the bottom of the
Oh, my.
line.
Oh,
Different.
okay.
You have to move yourself
Let
around.
me. Yeah, I guess now.
It's halfway. Okay. Um, is it here? Wait.
Okay.
Um,
I can also. Uh,
I don't know. Maybe if you move the thing, and he
yeah,
was.
yeah. Let me just reshare without my face. Okay.
Just see. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Oh. When he was speaking, his intellect visibly illuminated his face, always of winning presence. He became at these times still more engaging. A slight moisture gathered on his forehead. He radiated benignity. He was always as ready to entertain objections as he was powerful in meeting them. At one time, I myself kept interrogating him during 3 days as to how the soul is associated with the body. And he continued explaining. A man called Thamasius entered into the midst of our discussions. The visitor was more interested in the general drift of the system than in particular points, and said he wished to hear Plotinus expounding some theory, as he would in a set treatise, but that he could not endure Porphyry's questions. Plotinus asked, but if we cannot at first solve the difficulties Porphyry raises, what could go into the treatise? The fact is that these people did not understand this teaching. He was entirely free from all the inflated pomp of the professor. His lectures had the air of conversation. He never forced upon his hearers the severely logical substructure of his thesis. I myself, when I first heard him, had the same experience. It led me to combat his doctrinal paper, which I tried to show that the intelligibles exist outside the intellectual principle. The forms outside of nous, something like that. He
Yeah,
had my work read to him by Emilius. At the end, he smiled and said, "You must clear up these difficulties, Emilius. Porphyry doesn't understand our position." Emilius wrote a tract of considerable length in answer to Porphyry's objections. I wrote a reply to his reply. Emilius replied to my reply. At my third attempt, I came through, even so with difficulty to grasp a doctrine. Then, only was I converted, I wrote a recantation and read it before the circle.
right. So both of these, I mean, this shows how for Plotinus, you know, it's not that he was, his wisdom manifested not in presenting a completely argued point of view from the get-go in his classes. Rather, it was his ability to answer any of the challenges that were posed to him. Right? Sometimes he delegates this, like he delegates it to Emilius, to other um, things. But he also, although the positions are in his mind all worked out, right? He does not immediately, as in this translation, he never forced upon his hearers the severely logical substructure of his thesis. So this also indicates some social virtue of taking into account the um, his listeners and but also thinking that it's necessary to be able to answer all the points that anyone raises. Um, well, maybe not anyone, but rather probably anyone because of Emilius's report that the classes had very little structure because he let everyone ask questions. And we also saw at the beginning that they managed to sneak in the artist because anyone could attend. So that's also another side of uh, his social virtue. But this had limits, right? So he was quite careless, apparently, with expression. And Porphyry is explaining why he had to revise Plotinus's texts. Such revision was necessary. Plotinus could not bear to go back on his work even for one rereading. And indeed, the condition of his sight would scarcely allow it. His handwriting was slovenly. He misjoined his words. He cared nothing about spelling. His one concern was for the idea. In these habits, to our general surprise, he remained unchanged to the very end. I guess to our general surprise, because people probably pointed out, oh, you keep misspelling this words, and he would, till the very end, still misspell that word. He used to work out his design mentally from first to last. When he came to set down his ideas, he wrote out at one jet all he had stored in mind as though he were copying from a book. At the conferences, this is later, at the conference, he showed the most remarkable power of going to the heart of a subject, whether in exposition or in explanation, for this phrasing was apt. And this phrasing was apt, but he made mistakes in certain words. For example, he said anamnemisketai for anamimnesketai. Um, right. The Lloyd translation, the Gerson translation, translates this into English as he would say "mirember" instead of "remember." Um, we are told, and so this is. I'll get to this third text later. But so here, here there's also
Does this have
already this.
does this have also to do with like not being Greek, like he didn't go to the grammar school where they taught him pronunciation or something?
Yeah, it could be with not being Greek, although I mean he probably because the Greek was the intellectual lingua franca, so he probably studied it early, and he did live in Alexandria, which was a Greek-speaking city, and he studied with the like Ammonius, although Ammonius is not a Greek name, so his main teacher wasn't Greek himself. Um, and so he was so it could have that background. But it's already, and Plotinus will often use this image. I think we've already come across it. Yeah, it showed up in on Virtue of, the expressed speech is a poor image of the thought, and the thought and of our thoughts are a poor image of the um of nous and so on. So and he was indeed careless and also about how he expressed himself. The point was getting saying the right thing, right? So Porphyry says that his phrasing was apt, so he could express himself and says he got his meaning across, although from like a grammatical point of view, or from a strictly linguistic point of view, he wasn't speaking the highest and best Greek. Um, this is in part rhetorical presentation, so it's become a new thing in the scholarship to see um like the rhetorical skill of Plotinus, but at least in Porphyry's presentation, and this is and our interest is really in like Porphyry's presentation because it gives us an idea of the ethical theory. You know, the sage could ignore these things or hold them in lower esteem. Later on, there's this Emilius had went to Apollo, so probably to some what that means, unclear. Maybe he went to an oracle and asked, "Tell me, like, what is the fate of Plotinus' soul?" And Apollo produced this hymn to Plotinus. And and Porphyry comments on the hymn, and he says, "We are told that often when he was leaving the way, the gods set him on the true path again, pouring down before him a dense shaft of light. Here we are to understand that in his writing he was overlooked and guided by the divine powers." Of course, this might relating this to his writing might be a way of making this passage not so bad because it seems to imply that sometimes um, Plotinus veered off what was morally correct. In in Porphyry's interpretation, at least, what this means, the going off the path is writing down the things or expressing the things, right? And this has to then to do with this general idea that expression ideally you retain everything in yourself and you don't and that expression is already one step down, going one step down. So you need, as it were, special divine protection for you to get things right in expression, the image of the image. And we already saw Plotinus having concerns about the image of the image when he forbade people from producing an image of a portrait of him. And it also comes up in his biography because he was a so while he studied with Ammonius, he had these colleagues, and they had all actually sworn to secrecy that they would not pass on what they had learned from Ammonius. And he only gradually starts teaching this because his colleagues first break the silence. And so that's and one of these colleagues is called Origen. There's a big controversy about whether this was the same Origen, the Christian theologian, or not. Some people think it's the same person. Some people think it's different. But we don't need to get into that. But anyway, so this is his careless with expression. So it's 10:30 now there.
Yeah,
So
11:30.
all right,
Yeah.
11:30.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
so
I
so
always
let's
thought that this was like an apology for like the bad writing, making it into some kind of spiritual thing.
yeah,
Like he was,
it could be. Yeah. But I mean it kind of agrees with some of his ideas as well.
right,
Um
like it's like something like the Timaeus like kind of thing where we can't like where the physical kind of world or here also words are can only be the bad imitation and therefore it's like
right.
it's like a bad thing to to write things down.
Yeah.
Like would
Yeah.
be a different argument against writing from the Phaedrus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also you see like he's not someone who will like Proclus. He and indeed this is true. There is no elements of theology from Plotinus. Or systematic commentary of the Parmenides, explaining how the arguments of the Parmenides work and how they show the three hypostases. There isn't that. because there's this general skepticism towards expression and writing. There is care for other souls, there is care for other people. There's skepticism, however, of yeah, writing and images and that sort of thing. So the philosophy is the wisdom of the philosopher, right? And his ability then to come up with answers to challenges and explain things to his students and so on. We'll discuss his higher virtues then in the next class.
Okay.
Okay, but it's fun. I'm glad
Yeah.
we're working again.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.